sorry. Welcome, everyone. I'm the host for today's evening. I'm very pleased to welcome everyone in the Café Luitpold. This is an official side event of the Munich Security Conference 2024, the 60th edition, anniversary edition. And this event is entitled Risk-Free Proposition, Why It Matters to Have Leaders Who Champion Nuclear Arms Control. And on the panels, we have some of those leaders who will share their experience and knowledge with us. So this is a unique collaboration between the European Leadership Network, the Elders, and the Café Luitpold. And for those of you who are not familiar with the ELN and the Elders yet, let me just explain to you what we and what they do. So the European Leadership Network is a non-partisan, pan-European, London-headquartered think tank and a network of about 450 past and future and present leaders working to provide practical solutions to the most pressing security challenges. And the Elders are a network of independent global leaders who promote peace, justice, and human rights. And during this official MSC side event, we will discuss why it is important to have responsible political leadership today, and why it is so important that today's leaders place existential risks and, most of all, nuclear risks very high on their agenda. So we have a brilliant panel lined up, and it's going to be chaired by my brilliant colleague, Jane Kinninmont, who is the Policy and Impact Director of the European Leadership Network, who will guide the conversation. And I will now hand over to Jane. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. And we were here last night hearing Julia launch her first book on the new Cold War. It's really great to be part of a series here at Café Luitpold that opens up the topics of the Munich Security Conference to a broader audience and has a more inclusive approach. I'll hold this very far from me, maybe we can turn it down a bit. Tonight's event is being live streamed also, so this will be available to watch afterwards on YouTube, and we will have an interactive discussion, so you'll have opportunities to pose your own questions to our expert speakers. But I'm going to kick off by asking each person a question so they can give some introductory scene-setting remarks. And we'll be hearing from a really inspiring panel of leaders who have worked on arms control and many other global security issues, including Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway and Director General of the World Health Organization, a member of the Elders and also of the European Leadership Network. We hear from Bonnie Jenkins, US Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs and founder of Women of Colour Advancing Peace and Security, which seeks to bring more diverse perspectives, much needed, into the security field. We'll hear from Patricia Jaworek, Senior Programme Officer on Global Nuclear Policy at the Nuclear Threat Initiative in the US, and from Lord Browne of Ladyton, Des Browne, Chair of the European Leadership Network and a former UK Defence Secretary. So our subject is about leadership and arms control in times where geopolitical tensions and strains on multilateralism make all these things more difficult. And I think the leaders you'll be hearing from here tonight really represent an antidote to a lot of the poor or weak leadership we're hearing at the moment. So this is really a part of finding inspirational leadership for a better world. We've seen that the theme of this year's Munich Security Conference report is lose-lose. And as an organisation that's very interested in nuclear weapons, we felt there was perhaps not so much focus on nuclear weapons and nuclear arms control in that report, but there can be no greater example of lose-lose than nuclear weapons. Last year, we were glad to bring together nearly 250 leaders from around the world for a statement calling on the G7 to safeguard arms control from the wider geopolitical competition. We published this on the eve of their meeting in Hiroshima, also with an op-ed published in newspapers across Japan. But what we found powerful about it was we were able to bring together people from so many countries, including all the P5 states and India and Pakistan, able to agree that governments need to be sitting at the table and discussing limits on the world's worst weapons. So we think cooperation is possible, but without too much more from me, let me turn now to our fantastic panel. And I'm going to start here with Dr. Brundtland, who is a veteran of tackling many existential risks, having been the Prime Minister of Norway during the Cold War, to dealing with pandemics at the World Health Organization during the outbreak of SARS, and of course advocating innovatively for sustainable development to tackle climate change. Could you tell us more about what kind of leadership is needed, and what are some of today's leaders doing wrong?
Well, let me start by saying that as a young person choosing to become a medical doctor, on my mind was you need to prevent disease and social concerns. So from the beginning, the thought about prevention was on my mind. And then at Harvard School of Public Health, I met with the rest of the world, people, studying there for Master of that I had not learned from my country Norway. So I was 25, and after that year, my mind was clear that you need to follow knowledge-based, evidence-based for decision-making. Wherever you are in the position, there is no alternative if you have science and evidence as the basis. Now, if you can... Oh, sorry, I don't have that thing. Do you need it? Oh.
It's a very loud microphone.
Okay. Now, then, as I then moved back to Norway after that year and became a public health person, I then was called to enter the government as Minister of Environment. Now, what does that mean? Preventing, or, avoiding the environment getting undermined by the sum of what people are doing to affect it. Again, it is working together, preventing change, and thinking about the link between environment and people. And that means, as I then became environment minister for 6-7 years, and then prime minister, then, these existential threats that have evolved over my lifetime, they all are dependent on knowledge and sharing of knowledge, working together, having a dialogue about how we can move to avoid catastrophe, which is what we are now in. I mean, the nuclear threat was obvious. We had to work on that to have arms control and disarmament. And in this conference, not many have, we all have been working on saying, how do we try to avoid this geopolitical difficulty in the situation we are, to forget about what we have already achieved together in that area, nuclear threat. But the climate change and also pandemic risk. Remember that millions of people died because of the virus coming out from China, but spreading across the world. Trillions of dollars in cost to humanity. Again, we have to prevent. These are existential threats: the nuclear threat, the climate and sustainable development issue, and of course the threat of we are going to have new pandemics. I am a doctor. I know that it's going to come back, and we have no other way than long view leadership. Because when you look at the knowledge base, then that tells any leader that short-term solutions are not going to help us. You have to have a long view in order to do what is right. So as elder, as we heard from Jane, justice and human rights, peace, justice and human rights. None of that is possible without long view thinking and long view leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In these times we're in, what steps can be taken now to try to advance arms control?
First of all, thanks for inviting me. This is like an amazing place to hold these discussions. So thanks for inviting me, being on this panel, and for having such a lovely place here. When it comes to arms control, I mean, I think there's different perspectives. I guess I'll start out by saying that. I'm a veteran of arms control. I started doing this in the early 90s, actually, and worked on a number of treaties, many of which don't exist anymore. But I worked on CFE and Open Skies and CTBT and been on a number of implementing bodies. So I have a long history of arms control, and I respect arms control for what it can do. But I also think that we need to look at arms control as one of the ways in which we try to instill predictability and stability in the international affairs, international global community. And we were able at that time, and before that time, obviously since the early days of the treaties of the domains of the Outer Space Treaty, Seabed Treaty, Antarctic Treaty, to what we have with New START, be able to sit down at the table with adversaries, with friends and adversaries, to come to an agreement because we thought that things were so important that we could put aside our differences and deal with weapons that were detrimental to the human race. We were able to, when we come to Russia, even during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, to be able to decouple issues and have these agreements. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that now, with Russia, withdrawing from treaties and Russia de-ratifying treaties and Russia suspending treaties. The ability to decouple that we've been able to do for so long is not happening because Russia doesn't want to decouple from what's happening in Ukraine. And they know how much the international community values these treaties. Bear in mind, we have a lot of other treaties. There are other treaties that do exist that still hold up a norm. We still have treaties where you have over 180 countries who are parties. We still have implementing bodies that are upholding those norms. We have the BWC, the CWC, the NPT, the CTBT, which is developing a norm, even though it's not enforced yet. And we have others. So we have to put it also in context because we focus all the time, I think, on Russia. We also have to understand that there are other treaties that exist that we don't want to go away either. And we have to keep strengthening, and we have to keep working hard to maintain. And we have a lot of people working hard on that. So we are in a time now where everyone says all the time, I can't tell you how many times I get the question, what's the future of arms control? What's the future of arms control? We have to have a situation where people want to sit down and have conversations, where people want to sit down, countries want to sit down and negotiate, but it's about maintaining what we have, maintaining what's worked. And we're also in a position now where we have new challenges that don't necessarily lend themselves to traditional arms control. Whether you're talking about cyber, whether you're talking about emerging technologies, or you're talking about space, these are areas where we have to find other means of developing predictability in the international system that don't necessarily fit what we've been doing for many years. We also have to figure out what's going to be the future of conventional arms control in Europe, for example, without the CFE treaty now. I think that as we look at the landscape, we have to be honest and recognize where we are. The fact that Russia does not want to decouple. They want to use every opportunity to get out of treaties or make it difficult for treaties to be maintained because that's where they are. New START is where it is with its suspension. We have the situation with the other treaties and the challenges we have. But we can't give up on the idea and the need to develop some predictability in the international system because, you know, every state is a sovereign state. Every state can do what they want. You know, they don't have to abide by anything, but we have systems that exist, and we have to maintain those. So, you know, when we look about ask about what is the future of arms control, I think we need to look at it in a broader sense and not in a negative way, which is the way it's always portrayed, but to say, we need to figure this out. We need to figure out what is the future going to be, and if we have to maintain what we have, as I said, we have to do what we can and figure out new systems.
Thank you. So, Patricia, as a next generation leader, you're engaging with people globally on nuclear policy. How do you think these issues are going to play out in the longer term, given everything you've heard so far?
Yeah, thank you so much. First, I want to thank the ELN for including me in this panel. I think it's, you know, it's an honor to sit beside such a distinguished panel. And I think you ask a really good question, because the decisions that are made today have long-term consequences, especially for younger and future generations. And I think that decision makers and policymakers have a lot of good reasons for why they do things and why they take the actions they do, but there's not enough time spent on thinking through the consequences of those actions. So I think that if we continue on the current path, we risk entering in a future world that is dominated by global insecurity and arms racing, because a lot of the decisions that are made today are driven by mistrust. They are driven by zero-sum thinking and competition. And so I want to just briefly imagine this world thinking 5 to 10 years ahead. You know, as was already mentioned, we have one bilateral nuclear arms control agreement left, but thinking several years ahead, the absence of effective nuclear arms control would likely lead to an unconstrained arms race, not only between the United States and Russia, but also China, and that would have potential ripple effects for other nuclear powers like India and Pakistan, for example. And then relations between those nuclear powers would be much more unpredictable and much more uncertain because of a lack of transparency. And in addition to that, what we see, there's a lack of dialogue right now. If this deepens, the risk of misunderstandings and accidents rises, and therefore the risk of nuclear use because of that. We also heard about all the global challenges we face today: climate crisis, pandemics, emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence. And if those resources, government resources, are diverted away, you know, to defense budgets and military spending, I fear that global cooperation on those challenges will be really difficult in the future. So it is easy to see how these dynamics could lead to reaction cycles that could, you know, lead us down this downward spiral of hostility and instability. Sadly, if you play out the scenario, I think it resembles what my parents' generation knows very well from the times of the Cold War. And in a way, I believe, though, that the current scenario is even more dangerous today because we have more countries with nuclear weapons, we have emerging technologies, and there is minimal dialogue. So the risks, I think, are really, really great. So I would like us to pause here and actually appreciate how far we've come. And for me, working on nuclear issues is very personal in a way, because my parents are Polish, and during the Cold War, they lived behind the Iron Curtain, and I've heard many stories about that. And you know, that world was so different from the world that I grew up in. I was born in Germany a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that was a time that was characterized by you know, an era of, or the hope for peace and cooperation. So arms control is actually one of those elements of hope at that time. You know, the arms control agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union, and later Russia at the time, really signified that I was able to grow up without the threat of nuclear annihilation. So yeah, I think that for the entire time, unfortunately, that I've been working on nuclear issues for the past years, those hard-won successes of the past have been continuously rolled back, arms control agreements included. Russia is waging war against Ukraine and countries in Europe and around the world, because you mentioned, you know, there's not only Europe, there's the Asia-Pacific, there's other regions, and all those countries are drawing potentially very damaging lessons about the role that nuclear weapons play for national security and the role that nuclear deterrence plays as well. So there's also the nuclear threat is back in people's consciousness, that to a level that I don't think we've seen before, or at least for a long, long time. And as was mentioned before, there's also a shift towards all or nothing approaches, or as people also call it, a lack of compartmentalizing. So bilateral and multilateral dialogue is really taken hostage to the broader geopolitical environment. So it worries me very much when I hear, you know, the debate in Germany right now, for example, about bringing back a euro, or establishing a euro deterrent. It worries me when Poland feels it has the need to call for stationing U.S. nuclear weapons on their territory, because it just brings us down a very dangerous spiral. So everything that I mentioned very much resembles the behaviors that we had during the Cold War, and the world is much more complex. So I think it's really important, and as you said, the Munich Security Report mentioned those lose-lose scenarios and sort of the very difficult task of managing deterrence and defense, and on the other side, really making sure that we don't go down this vicious cycle. So I believe that we need approaches, and arms control and risk reduction as well are part of this broader tool set that create the space for dialogue and reestablishing trust in the long term, because I don't want us to close communication channels that were established over years. I don't want us to completely stop talking. I want us to keep the opportunity spaces in the future, so we can be ready for when politically things shift, which can happen very quickly, as we know from history, that we're ready to go down this path. And I think one leader can make a difference, right? We've seen that in the past, and leaders have made very difficult decisions in the past on arms control. They have displayed a lot of moral courage as well. And I hope that we don't have to see the next catastrophe before we see that type of leadership emerge. So, yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I like this idea of opportunity spaces. So, Des.
This will be an easy question, won't it?
You've worked for many years inside and outside of government trying to advance the concept of mutual security. How do you try to convince leaders to overcome the short-term thinking and look towards a more cooperative world?
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Jen. First of all, I want to say how pleased I am to be on a panel with 4 women. I mean, quite often I've been at events where the panels are much tilted the other way. I'm also pleased to be on this panel, and I'm sure that Dr. Brundtland will forgive me for this description, but she and I are people who used to be something. I mean, I'm a member of the House of Lords, and it's a part of this UK Parliament made up of people who used to be something. But the great thing about this is that on this panel we have people who used to be something. We have in Bonnie a person who clearly is something and can affect it. And we have in Patricia the real solution to this problem, the people who will be something and who need to get together to build the trust and confidence across the space that we're worried about, so that when they are something, then they will go into those jobs with the trust and confidence we lack. So the second point I want to make is that, and Dr. Brundtland mentioned this, but I just want to focus it. So almost every country that's represented in this room has a risk assessment. I bet you that the risk assessment, like the UK one and the US one, has 4 existential risks at the top of it. It has climate change, it has nuclear weapons in particular, and it has pandemic, which is a shortened description of biorisk, which is much more complicated than pandemic, but it is focused on pandemic. And it has AI, potentially generative AI, which none of us understand really, even the people that build it. And we don't know where this is going to go. I mean, it's an interesting aspect of the current arms race that we have, but we've never been in an arms race before. The capability will keep running after the humans have stopped running. So, so we all have this. And the thing about all of these risks, as Dr. Brundtland said, is that they are a common risk to all of us. And quite simply, none of us are safe from these risks should they manifest unless we're all safe. Which was why it was a failure, you know, not to inoculate or to give the vaccine to Africa at the early stage of the pandemic and leave this as a petri dish for the COVID to work away and to its various forms. Anyway, we won't go on any more about that, but I just want to say that that's the foundation for mutual security. And today in the lunch that I attended, Wolfgang Ischinger came and he gave us a hint of how this great Munich Security Conference has started 60 years ago, you know, when post the Cuban Missile Crisis, a group of Europeans and Americans got together and started looking at how they could live in the world that was potentially going to develop out of that crisis. And he was lamenting the absence, you know, the disaggregation of the infrastructure that had been created post then by their efforts and others, and also the loss of arms control, although we haven't, as has been said correctly, lost all of this, and CTBT is there, the NPT is there, I mean, other arms control. But the vision of mutual security based around multilateral nuclear disarmament in the Euro-Atlantic region, which we should constantly remind ourselves is a geographical and political space that includes the European Community of Nations. Now I think the UK kind of sits outside that. That's not my fault, I have to tell you, but we're there. Russia and the United States appears more distant today than any time in the past 30 years. And it was a slow retreat from this mutual security. It's not the product, unfortunately, of a fresh global consensus around the desirability of courting existential risk, but is a byproduct of great power competition across a variety of thematic and geographical areas. It's much more complicated than just the space that we live in. The consensus now in much of Europe is that convergence with Russia does not work. Hence, the West is now decoupling from Russia, and you know, the conference, those of us who have been at it for the last few days, is full of that. I mean, this is a fool's errand, they say. The war in Ukraine has undermined security for all citizens, and leaders face risks of miscalculation, compounded by the potential for the use of nuclear weapons, where millions would be killed in minutes. And we must ensure that a nuclear war is never fought, because it can never be won. The heart of the problem is a complete lack of trust among nations, stemming from the war, but also stemming from the history of the past 15 years, when this trust and confidence in each other has decayed and we haven't managed it. And the consequent inability of leaders and nations to engage collectively and comprehensively on an extremely difficult menu of issues relating to regional security. This has led to an expanding grey zone of competition between states, raising the risk of escalation. And thus far, diplomacy has failed insofar as it's been unable to silo or to disaggregate specific areas of anthropogenic risk from the military conflict. So, I mean, in a sense, if we don't address this issue and create the mutual security, it's not just the use of nuclear weapons that we should worry about. It's almost every one of these threats that we have a concern about. We've seen nuclear blackmail re-emerge upon mainland Europe, with Putin and senior Russian officials exploiting doubts about institutional stability to put Western countries on notice that their calculus, their calculus in respect of nuclear risk, may not be entirely rational, and that's very worrying. When we consider today's central contention that it matters to have leaders who champion arms control and see it as a tool of pragmatic policy making, rather than a receding utopian vision there are issues we must face. And they are, no nation benefits from a persistent and deadly war and threats of an even more devastating conflict. Governments that are openly adversarial today cannot indefinitely avoid their shared responsibility to work together to mitigate the risks arising from today's security environment as well as future challenges. Nations still have existential common risks in areas relating to nuclear and biological threats, as well as managing new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, that we don't control. Mutual security is the best guidepost, and we must be made resilient to these big shocks. Where I hope seeing hostile actors and strategic adversaries ease back slightly from the brink, and at the very least participate in some of the institutions which underpin mutual security in recent months. In November, we saw Chinese participation in the Bletchley Park summit about artificial intelligence security, and being willing to subscribe to a set of mutually agreed, if somewhat inchoate, guardrails on AI development. Equally, both Russian and Chinese represented attended the UAE for COP28. This is not to say their participation was much more than perfunctory in some respects, but they weren't alone in that, in fact, in terms of driving global agreement. But their participation was still a tacit acknowledgement of the importance of and the need to curtail anthropogenic existential risk. But to return to the focus of this discussion, I believe, and my colleagues in the Nuclear Threat Initiative and those whom we work with in the Euro-Atlantic Security Leadership Group, which has been working across this space, including Russians and Ukrainians for the best part of a decade, we believe that a set of agreed principles can provide a foundation for officials and experts to re-engage and eventually make progress towards shrinking this grey zone, reducing nuclear risks and building mutual security. And if you bear with me just for a couple of minutes, I'll explain to you what these principles could include. We debated these with a very diverse audience this afternoon, and nobody suggested, so I warn you, don't, that any of these are the wrong principles. First of all, we need to restore dialogue. We need to talk to each other. This idea that we don't do business as usual with each other is nonsense. We never did do business as usual with each other. It was always very exceptional and very difficult for those who did it. But we need to restore dialogue. The absence of dialogue erodes trust, and the trust necessary for building mutual security. It hinders our ability to understand the perspective of others, and that's a really important thing that we lack the ability to be able to do, is to see ourselves as others see us. It sharpens mistrust and it increases risks. Across the region, restoring dialogue now between leaders remains essential to creating the political space for civilian and military officials to engage on a range of issues. Second, we need to manage instability. In the near term, dialogue should be focused on just that, managing the instability that is there and ever present across the whole region. We don't, however, want dialogue simply to reinforce the status quo, but rather we need to define where we would like to be in, for example, 10 years and identify tools necessary to get there. Of course, we must address what's immediately in front of us, but we must do this in a context of where we want to be. You know, for Patricia's generation and others, we need to have some idea of the world we want to live in, and we need to aim towards that. We need to recognise diversity and security. Threats are changing. China and India loom larger than they did 10 years ago. It's getting harder to compartmentalise Europe and harder to frame a European approach to security. Nations in the Euro-Atlantic space must be more ambitious and inclusive of the world, and sensitive to technology as a catalyst to adapt our thinking. We must adopt a multi-basket approach. Mutual security needs to integrate practical steps that address security, human security, economic security and political concerns of nations in the Euro-Atlantic space, and importantly in the global south. Because these people get nothing out of nuclear weapons other than risk. They have no deterrent, they have no extended deterrent, it's just all risk for them. And we need to bring them on board, and we need to listen to them. We need to increase leadership decision time. We're far too quick to ask people to make decisions that have atrocious consequences sometimes too quickly. And artificial intelligence will put this on steroids. creating robust and acceptable methods to increase decision time for leaders, especially during heightened tensions and extreme situations where leaders fear that they may be under threat of attack, could be a common conceptual goal that links both near and long-term steps for managing instability and working towards mutual security. And finally, if I can find this page, excuse me, I just want, oh, sorry about this. This is not very impressive, is it? Anyway, okay, finally, and I'll just quickly deal with these, we need to manage and control emerging threats and technologies. And that's the real difficult challenge. Because the danger is that these technologies will think quicker than we can. We need to identify and advance areas of existential common risk, and we need to talk about them all the time. We need to increase transparency and predictability. Steps that increase transparency and predictability are essential to reduce near-term risks and over the long term to restore cooperation and trust. We're all too keen to keep secrets of things and create spaces where people can imagine we're doing things that are far worse than they actually are. So even as the Euro-Atlantic region recedes from primacy in terms of the provision of mutual security, it remains possible to give a lead. We can work together. These principles are pragmatic, they're attuned to the exigencies of the realpolitik, and they're applicable to all areas of anthropogenic existential risk. So I look forward to our discussions this evening and to hoping to persuade that these issues provide a viable sinew of diplomacy that needs strengthening rather than something to be considered purely in the abstract. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're exactly halfway through our time, so it's time now to open the floor. And let's bring in Bonnie to respond to Des. Are you going to quiz him on the principles?
No, the principles are great. So that's not the thing. Just a couple points. And when we talk about the need for dialogue, I think we have to keep in mind that when I say we, I mean the U.S. is very much in the dialogue. That's why we want to talk to the PRC. That's why we want to get Russia back to the table. But it's Russia and the PRC that doesn't want to talk. And so we have to find a way to get all of these discussions, we're kind of speaking to the choir. We all believe in this. We all know why we need to do this. But we're not saying it to the Chinese and the Russians, and if they're not around to hear it. But we need to have more of this with them. And the challenge is, there's different systems. And we can sit around and talk about this, but the ones who really need to hear that we need a dialogue, which we're trying to tell them, are the ones that unfortunately are not often in these kind of discussions. On the issue of the Global South, I'm so glad you raised that, because obviously we need to find ways to bring in the Global South. And in terms of nuclear issues, there's a lot that's going on that the IEA is doing, that the US is doing with the UK on sustained dialogues in terms of nuclear technology, which doesn't get enough attention at all. And I know my colleague, DG, from the IEA is always trying to get countries to recognize all the things we're doing and that they're doing to promote nuclear technology in the Global South on, cancer treatment and food security and water sanitation issues. They have an Atom for Food program, Rays of Hope program. And one of the things that we're trying to do is when we meet with countries in the Global South, we're trying to let them know that there are things that we're doing that you're probably not recognizing, because I understand when we go and talk to them about these hard security issues, very often I'll get back, well, what are you guys doing for development? And there's a lot that we're doing in development. I mean, as my colleagues from state know, I asked my bureau, my 3 bureaus, and AUKUS that I also work on, look at the 17 SDGs and tell me what you're doing. And they came back with a 30-page document, which talked about and in every single SDG, they were talking about things that they're doing that nobody knows about. And it's hard to get attention to that kind of stuff. So, when we talk about the Global South, we have to find ways to help them understand what we are doing, even in the hard security areas. Soft security is a little easier to understand, but there are things that we're trying to do, and we need to find a better way to help them understand that we want to help with development. So those are just a couple of things I just wanted to respond. But as I said to you earlier, the 7 ideas are fine, and they're good, and we support them.
No, I was just, I mean, we are in a situation where everything that's been said here about nuclear weapons, about the nuclear threat, I agree with all of it, and the 7 principles, all of it. But when you think of the global governance system, it is sorely lacking. I mean, as you have said, multilateralism has been pushed back by the geopolitics of the present difficult times. But it is multilateralism and global cooperation that we sorely need, and the risk that we are all fearing is to deal with it. There is no alternative to increase global cooperation. Now, we are lacking not only in using the multilateral system, but there is not enough funding at all to deal with the climate crisis, which again is linked to what you were talking about, Grace now, sustainable development. These are global issues where we are in this situation together. We have one common future or no future. This is the kind of existential risks that we are facing. And I mean, the US or the European countries are not doing enough so far to increase the total funding to avoid climate crisis or to deal with the risk of a new pandemic. So it's not enough to explain to the Global South. They have to feel that they are part of the solution and that they are part of finding the ways forward for a better and safer world.
Just to that, just to expand on that, some of the programs that we're doing in sustainable development, we're actually going to some countries and working with them. For example, we're looking at how to improve water sanitation in some countries. So we actually go there, and they lead the discussions, and they actually are putting together a lot of the plans. So, so when we do these outreaches, we understand the importance of listening to what it is these countries need, and then it's more of helping provide them what they need based on what we hear from them. So I definitely take your point, because when we talk about sustainability, that's the way we make sure there's sustainability. So.
We've also got countries from the Global South now turning round to the nuclear weapons states and saying, we'd like to tell you about nuclear weapons-free zones, and, you know, why don't you behave more like us? So it's interesting. But let me bring in you. My lovely colleague Julia, who introduced us, has a roving microphone, and she can come round and bring you in if you'd like to raise your hand. Anyone who would like to ask a question either to the whole panel or one specific member, or share your comments. And generally speaking, there are no stupid questions, so please do feel free. And if you don't mind briefly introducing yourself, that would be great too. Thank you.
Very well. My name is Natalia Valeria Müller. I'm the chairwoman of the Young Council on German Foreign Relations, and it is my great honor to be present here, because tomorrow at 10 a.m. we'll be hosting Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins at our event about the role of women in promoting security and nuclear disarmament. So this was like a sweet treat before the main event for me tomorrow. My question is, I would say to all panelists, you've talked about how we are preaching to the choir, so to speak. And when we are here at the Munich Security Conference, where states like Iran, North Korea, and Russia are not present or not even welcome, we know what we have to do to promote more security and a world where nuclear arms or nuclear disarmament is, you know, the status quo. How do we get to talk, get the cooperation going in those partners who seemingly do not want to talk with us? who are refusing cooperation? And is it even possible, looking at the state of the world right now, were we even talking about having a European nuclear bomb? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's something really for all of the panelists. So I'm just looking around to see if we might collect another question. Yes, please, over here. Yes, give Julia 2 seconds. She's running to you.
I'll step a bit out of the
Thank
flower, if that's okay. I'm sorry for the... my name is Elena Chernenko. I'm a journalist from Russia. I work for a Russian newspaper, which is called Kommersant, cover mainly nuclear non-proliferation issues and arms control. So my question is mostly to Ambassador Jenkins, but also if anybody else who would like it to tackle. There is lots of discussion on nuclear-related space threats right now in the US. And as far as I understand, US officials are planning to do outreach to Russia at some point about this. A few years ago, Russia and China have proposed a treaty at the UN to ban nuclear-placed weapons in space, space-based weapons. But there was seemingly no interest from Western countries to discuss this. So the question is that whether maybe you think it's the right time to come back to this. Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps we can start with you, Bonnie.
Sure, why not? So on the first question about how to reach out to them, you know, I think this is the role for, you know, track 2. This is a role for young people who may want to have a little more freedom than I do, for example, in the U.S. government, to reach out to people and to engage. You know, as the next generation, you don't have to have the same structures and limits that the generation before you has, depending on who runs and who's leading. And you can be leaders, and you can try to change this. And there's always opportunities. Thank God there's next generations always, because they can make opportunities and change them. So we have the challenges that we have now that we can try to fix. But this is also an opportunity to reach out, you know, and talk to people from different countries, and not just the ones we're talking about, you know, with Russia and China per se. You know, there's just limits, of course, with Russia right now because of what's going on in Ukraine, and I know that's limited a lot of track 2 conversations, though I think some are able to still continue. But do what you know, engage as you can, you know, outside of government, because we in the government don't know everything. And we learn from those who are outside, and we have limits that others don't have. So we'll keep trying to change it as we can in the government, and hopefully others can support us. On the space threat, yeah, there was a couple proposals by Russia and China for a treaty, but some of the challenges are one, the dual-use nature of some of the, you know, the satellites and everything that's up there creates a problem in terms of verification. We wouldn't know how to verify something like that. When I talk about there are issues that are not yet ripe, doesn't mean they never will be. Whenever countries sat down to negotiate an arms control treaty, it's usually after they've spent a long time domestically, or weapons have existed for a while before they get to the point that they say, we need to sit down and do something about it. I'm not sure we're at that point yet with space, because I think there's still a lot of questions in terms of whether the time is right for a legally binding treaty outside of the existing open outer space treaty. But that doesn't mean we won't get there, and that doesn't mean that in the meantime we cannot develop norms that can help to start regulating the international system and how countries deal with space. So that's really why. It's not because it's just not the right time. It was also a little, we saw it as a little hypocritical, because they were saying that they wanted to have a treaty when we knew, you know, they were doing anti-satellite missile tests, and they wanted to have a treaty. So it didn't seem to be quite genuine. You know, it's more, you know, were they saying it because they already knew that a number of countries didn't want it? So it's easy to say we want something and it sounds good when you know it's not going to happen. And it just did, it wasn't, the time's not right, and it didn't seem genuine. Thanks.
I mean, I'll resist the temptation to tell either the Americans or the Russians what they should do about this discussion they're having. You know, I mean, I think it's time the British stopped going around the world telling people how they should run their affairs. So I just want to make an observation about what we've heard about this. I mean, I came to an event last year's Munich Security Conference in here, which was discussing, you know, the conduct of the war in Ukraine from a Ukrainian perspective. It was an extremely interesting event, and it became very apparent that the use of Starlink, which is owned by Elon Musk, by the Ukrainian government, had been significantly important to their ability to be able, at that stage, to resist the Russian invasion and the speed of it. So, I mean, we kid ourselves if we're not already, you know, operating out of space in conflict and, you know, using space capability to enhance our ability to be able to use nuclear weapons. Space already matters. And in fact, you know, I mean, all ballistic missiles are designed to go into space and come out of space for reasons to do with protecting them in their route to their target and various other things. So, I mean, this is nothing new. But increasingly, my observation is, as I watch new technologies appear on the scene that have dual use, and quite often quite devastating dual use. It's not all to do with conflict, but it's maybe just to do with the way in which it is deployed for misogynistic purposes, for example, deep fakes and these apps, you know, nudify apps. And there is a collective sort of reluctance on the part of governments, and this is not a division between East and West or North and South. There's just a collective reluctance on the part of them to regulate these new technologies at the point of their creation, but to try to regulate them at the point of their application. So, because nobody wants to be seen to be preventing innovation on their patch, because there is this collective desire to be world leaders in these new technologies such that they can drive our economies and we can become important people. So we don't want to be seen to be crushing innovation. We want to be seen to be places where these people who make monstrous amounts of money will come and do business in our patch. So increasingly, and the United Kingdom is exactly in this space, which is, has decided to regulate artificial intelligence at the point of application. And I just think, you know, there are just some of these dual-use technologies that we should stop production of at all. I mean, I don't understand why deep fakes are allowed. I mean, the clue is in the name. It's a fake. You know, everything else that is a fake is illegal, you know, or fraud. It is a fake. And it's clear enough very quickly that the use of these deep fakes is not to the enhancement of anybody's life. It's to the detriment of people's lives, and in particular women. You know, and in my country, 86% of people, you know, the majority of people in my country are ambivalent about artificial intelligence, but when it comes to deep fakes, 86% of them want them banned. They want them banned. And I think we need to, you know, with these technologies, sort of realize that what the, in particular in artificial intelligence, what the people who are behind the invention of it, as it were, and the development of it in the early years, plus the people that do it now seriously were saying to us collectively a few months ago, you need to stop us doing this, because this generative AI is potentially very dangerous. You know, we need to collectively get the risk that we have put in our risk assessment. We need to live up to that assessment and say some of this stuff has to be stopped until it becomes controlled and predictable, and we understand what we're doing here, and particularly until it becomes stable and deterministic. That is, that we can predict exactly what it will do and not non-deterministic. I never used the word non-deterministic in my life before until AI came on the scene. but because we can't rely upon it. And I just feed this into the technology area. It's got nothing to do with space particularly, but it's got to do with these technologies. But don't kid yourself, we're already using space for fighting wars.
Well, I'm going to bring in Patricia and Gru, but I can't resist also jumping in to say that we at ELN did some research last year with the support of the State Department, where we reviewed the academic and think tank literature in all the P5 countries on AI and the risks that it posed to nuclear weapons systems. And what was so fascinating about it is that basically everybody is worried about the same things. But that's not enough to get them to cooperate when everyone also wants to win the race. But at least there's something there in terms of an understanding and a concern. Over to you, Patricia.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to come in really briefly on the question about how to talk, to other people, other countries that don't want to talk to us. And I absolutely want to emphasize the value that those young generation networks have for building up the process. And off the top of my head, there are several examples of well-functioning networks like the YGLN, like, for example, also the Deep Cuts Commission, which is like a trilateral commission between Americans, Germans, and Russians that focuses on arms control. There's the Emerging Voices Network from BASIC that, almost is pretty global in scope and engages on a variety of issues, be that, feminist foreign policy to gender and disarmament to, just different issues that don't get that much presence in the current discourse. And I think it is really important to build that understanding of different perceptions and different cultural understandings, because you look at different regions around the world and everyone comes to those risks with their own perceptions, with their own threats and understandings of the issue. And it is really important to build that mutual understanding. So in a way, it's a really tough moment to answer that questions, but I would say there is hope. And also it's a moment to really go back to the basics, in my opinion. I think we really have to maintain what is already there, the spaces that exist for dialogue, like, even a forum like the P5 that might seem like it's stale at the moment or, is not as active as it could be, but those spaces exist and it's really important to maintain what we have. So I would just underscore, the value of the young generation, but also really protecting what we already have.
Thank you. Can I bring you in, Drew?
This
question of talking to those that don't want to.
Well, I just agree with what she was just saying, so I'm not sure I have to repeat it. But I saw this lady in red raising her hand there, so I'm now working as a moderator.
It's a team. Thank you for multitasking. Okay, we'll definitely take both.
Dorothea Böhm, Zonta International. I just want to ask if you really think that in a situation like now, where the balance of power, the old force de frappe, is going to be rebuilt, and everybody speaks about it, someone who is not following the rules of war now, is following the rules of nuclear limitment. Do you think they will get to nuclear limits only if we decide it? I have the impression that we are in since yesterday at least, in a world that is going to rebuild nuclear power because they want to keep the balance of power. And I have another question. Do you have, how many women are involved in the processing? I only see men when I see all these guys talking about it, deciding about it.
Not here.
I know. Also, it's
yes.
rare to see a woman being in the decision of what weapons are taken. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, I also would like to come back to the, well, my name is Katja Keul, State Minister at the Foreign Office. to come back to the debate that we are having in Germany and on this conference right now, because we might also think about talking to other cultures, other countries, but I think right now we have a problem among Europeans ourselves, and we have a debate that we have to lead among each others. When I listen to what proposals I've heard during the last days and read about them, and I think that this round has a responsibility also to communicate into this new debate we have, because for many, many years it seemed clear that we were all striving for disarmament, that we were all defending the NPT, and all of a sudden this is not anymore the debate that's going on. All of a sudden it's, well, if Trump is elected, then there is a gap in deterrence, and then we need more or better or whatever nuclear deterrence. So this is a debate that's taking place, and I think this is something we urgently need to talk about, coming back and explaining what is deterrence, how does it work, and that it's strategic and not tactical, and these kind of things that we need. I mean, we need to explain that wars, also wars among nuclear powers, they are decided by conventional capacities. That's what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, and that we need to invest in conventional capacities, and that there won't be a solution with tactical weapons being stationed now in, I don't know how many European countries. So this is a really, to me, it's like a shock for somebody who's been working for this disarmament for so many years. It's a shock all of a sudden to have, like, we're starting at zero again. We need to explain what the problem is with nuclear weapons, all from the beginning. And especially with the young generation. I mean, I see this in my own party as well. There's some young generations, not you, obviously, but there's also a special need to communicate about what we are talking about. We don't play around with nuclear weapons, and it seems something that we have to explain again. So I really would hear or, know that we together, we see this responsibility to lead this debate here. I mean, there's no sense in leading a debate with the Russians right now. This is not leading anywhere. We have to wait for a better time. But our debate is what's important now. That's what I feel.
Thank you very much. We'll also bring in the gentleman here at this front table, please.
Thank you so much, and apologies for being a gentleman. Yes. Robert Floyd, I'm the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. Former Prime Minister Brundtland, how inspiring to hear a politician talk about the importance of long-term thinking. Amazing. Which caused me to think is, we're focusing here today on new technologies and concerns about the future and maybe some political challenges. But I'd love to hear your view, and maybe Patricia's view, others could buy in too. How important is leadership? How important is leadership? Some say everything rises and falls on the quality of leadership. One of the qualities is long-term thinking. But is that something we should be focusing more on building the quality of leadership? Interested in your views.
Thank you so much. I think our whole panel will have things to say, but can we start with you? Yeah, thank you.
Well, yeah, it was, you were speaking about the lack of women in decision-making processes. Well, and that certainly, I'm sure, is right. But on this panel, we are really good, huh? And even in the audience here, there are many women, which illustrates that there is really a broad-based attention about the importance of these issues, women and men alike, I guess. I mean, then let me try to answer your question. One thing that I didn't say when I gave my original remarks, as a leader, you have to have courage. And then the question is, why are not many populations who are the ones who are voting, putting enough emphasis on that kind of characteristic of their leaders. And I'm afraid that in a way it was easier in my time. Because, for instance, in Norway, there was, when I was an environment minister and a deputy leader of the Social Democratic Party, there was only one channel on television. People saw the same news. They knew the same basic things that were happening both in their own country and globally. Then you can jump through many stages until we have social media and everything to fake, which he was talking about. It is so much more difficult because people are not knowing the same thing. So when I said, you know, I felt as a young politician and as a young person before that, you have to make decisions based on evidence. And of course, I didn't mention, which is obvious, principles and values, yes, but knowledge-based evidence. And then if you share that with people, most people listen. But they have to be able to listen to the same things and knowing when people are speaking untruths. You know, today it is much more difficult for people. So this is why I feel, you know, what do we do in today's situation? How do you build long view, long-term leadership in a world which is so multifaceted with regard to what people are listening to, what they need? They don't even read anymore. The young people are looking at their screens. They read less and less. And so I'm worried, I have to say, that because if you can see, if you can follow a political leader and see that he or she is speaking the truth, is following up on what they are saying, and I had a couple of terrible situations in my own time as a politician where I knew that I could lose a specific important question in the environmental era, for instance. But to me it was so important that as a deputy leader of my party and as an environment minister, I decided I'm going to stay this course, even if I lose. I was ready to think I'm leaving my post if I cannot do what I think is right, after having explained to people why it was the right way to choose. And on one occasion in my parliamentary group, I won one of these critical issues with one vote. And my parliamentary leader at the time, who was a generation older than me, he warned me on that same day, saying, "Gro, are you aware how split our group is on this issue?" I said, "Yes, but we have that meeting. I'm going to argue, and I'm hoping we get the right conclusion." And, you know, I won by one vote. But, you know, it has to do with courage and long-term thinking. Yeah.
Thank you. Ambassador Jenkins.
Let's see. I'm not going to respond to the question of women only because I think you did a great job on that, and we certainly need to do more in women in this area. So I'll just leave it at that. We're better than we used to be, but we have to do a lot more. On the question of the discussions that are going on, you know, I think we're still looking at issues of like the NPT and disarmament. Those things are still important. But I think the reason why you're seeing so many other debates now about deterrence is because the landscape is changing. And this is happening almost everywhere. We're looking at the balance of deterrence and looking at rising, with China more nuclear weapons and what's happening with Russia and, the whole litany with the DPRK and Iran, which is still doing their thing. But the environment's changing. The international security environment is changing in so many ways that it's causing, naturally, questions about deterrence and what do we need for our deterrence in this new environment. But it also goes back to the question of diplomacy and arms control, because diplomacy, arms control and deterrence, we say, are two sides of the same coin. So you still need to have your discussions about strengthening arms control, strengthening, the NPT, the mechanisms that we need to maintain the diplomatic side, the engaging side, and also looking at the terrorism. And it's changing because the environment's changing. So it's a natural reaction to that. Needing and on the issue of the one thing I think is needed is, as we see social media and less reading, I think we just need more critical thinking too. I think we need to. I think not just young people, but I see they're seeing it more. But all of us, as we have more platforms, as we have more information, I think we need to teach young people critical thinking in terms of reading something and saying, okay, maybe that's interesting. Let me check the other sources. Let me think about what, is that the truth? Let me Google it a little bit more. Let me check a few more. I think we need to do more of that. And I think just the spontaneity of information makes it, I think, it easier to kind of read and just kind of say, this may be the truth. So I think that's something that we need more. The younger generation, and I always think it's always important to explain to the young generation about the problems of nuclear weapons. I feel pretty good. I'm in a room of young women and young men here who kind of get it, and I know that we are maybe insular, I don't know. But as you explained, the many youth involvements on these issues, I think the youth can explain it to the youth. I don't think it always has to be us explaining to it. I think youth hearing it from others, I think is a good mechanism to continue to explain, arms control and why it's important, and the issues of nuclear weapons and why they're bad, and why we should continue to do everything we can to strengthen what we have and the mechanisms against them. So I think we have young leaders now who can do that with others as well. I think I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And of course, we are on YouTube, so hello, young people. But let me bring in Patricia and Des, and just a reminder also, if we could follow up on Katja Kohl's question about the German debate about needing to expand European nuclear weapons, or is that the path to madness? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think I can combine the two questions a little bit. First of all, I think leadership is very important. I mean, we often say that escalation depends on sort of risk assessments of individual leaders, but that also counts for positive measures. But at the same time, I don't think we can expect that the debate is led in a nuanced way, or at the nuance that it should be held, if we don't always emphasize that deterrence and defense goes hand in hand with arms control and diplomatic measures. So we hear a lot, especially currently in Europe, I feel, and with new NATO members joining, about like raising the nuclear IQ, and this always somehow refers to raising the nuclear IQ in terms of deterrence, but it doesn't really bring in the arms control and risk reduction side to the same extent. So I would hope that the debate would be more nuanced, and that there would be more critical thinking and analysis about what effective deterrence means. I think the conclusion is always very quick. People are quick to say deterrence, so we need more nuclear weapons. But there are so many other facets of deterrence that should be explored, and there should be a debate about that. And I think the openness to debate is also needs to be emphasized, because we often find ourselves in those bubbles and echo chambers. But really engaging, whether that be in in younger generation networks or across generations, but like engaging with people who might have different opinions and then really test your own arguments. Sometimes that can be really interesting too. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And
yeah, well, I'm broadly a skeptic about deterrence. I mean, I think it's a generic phrase which, when it's used with, you know, in a certain company, everybody thinks of nuclear deterrence, and people think of other things when they think of deterrence when they're not so fixed about the idea of nuclear deterrence. My own view is that nuclear deterrence has failed. And it failed at the point at which Vladimir Putin suggested that he would, in certain circumstances in this illegal war against Ukraine, use tactical nuclear weapons. And in anticipation of that, he blackmailed us with nuclear weapons. Once, you know, people use nuclear weapons that they are only legally entitled to have for deterrence, for blackmail, then deterrence has failed. And it failed to the extent that we did not protect the skies above Ukraine because of the risk of escalation. There is no question that that was the decision we made. And if we had protected the skies above Ukraine from his ability to be able to bomb at liberty, then it would have been, the early part of this war, which moved quickly in favour of Ukraine, may well have ended very quickly. So I just make that point that, you know, I'm sceptical about this. I once met someone who tried to persuade me that that there was a possible use beyond the legal use of nuclear weapons, which was to restore deterrence. He said we should be able to use a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I'm not going to offend people, but I said to him, you know, deterrence is like virginity. When you lose it, it's gone. You can't restore it. And I think we need to move from talking about deterrence to talking about resilience. We need to create resilient societies and that are resilient. And I go back to the point where we started, because Dr. Brundtland did this and I reinforced it. The existential risks that we face are common risks, and we need to build communities that are resilient to them. And if we're not all resilient, we are all at risk. So we need to build resilient communities, and we should concentrate on that. And it is, of course, but it is a long-term challenge. And I don't accept that politicians are incapable of long-term decision-making. But politicians who operate in a democratic environment, either every 4 or 5 years have to go to their electorate and get their entitlement, their right to continue to do what they do, reinforced. They have to get the political capital again. So you cannot, in a democratic circumstance where you want the opportunity to remove people and make them accountable on a regular basis, demand that they make decisions that are uniquely or universally beyond the point of their re-election. They have to go and say, we did something in this space to justify you giving us permission to continue to do the longer term things that we need to do, and we're very reluctant to do that. In the days when I was an elected politician and I was canvassing, knocking doors, talking to people, they would open the door and I would introduce myself and say, is there something that you wish me to deal with as your local member of parliament? And I guarantee you that the first thing that they said to me, I could see from their front door. Whatever it was that was most troubling them was either the children's play park that had not been fixed, the holes in the roads that weren't fixed, or something, or the neighbour next door who was allowed to breach the planning regulations to put up a fence that blocked their light. You could see it from their front door. People have very short-term challenges, and they expect their politicians to deal with it. So you have to understand that. So how you all exercise your votes, you have to think about. In my constituency, when I was first elected, we had a school building exercise, and we were building schools. I persuaded the people who were building them to leave the scaffolding up until the next election was passed. Because as soon as the scaffolding came down and I mentioned that we'd provided a school, they said, no, that was always there. You had nothing to do with that. You know, but as long as the scaffolding stayed up and it was in the future, you'd get it. So you have to, I think we have to understand that and stop talking about politicians being incapable of long-term thinking. They're not. It's just very difficult to do it without doing something else. But when it comes to leadership, leadership's everything. It's everything. The best organisations, the best multilateral organisations in the world are the best leaders. The best schools have the best leaders. The best hospitals have the best leaders. Leadership is everything. And of course we should teach leadership, but we should teach it to everybody. And we need leadership in a context in which we're trying to build a society. But the most important thing is to have strategic vision. But not only strategic vision, but a plan as to how to get there. There's plenty of vision. People talk about vision all the time, but you need a plan as to how to get there. One of the great things about working for NTI as I do is that they have a path always of short steps and longer steps to get to the point that is the vision. And that's the way in which we need to govern. So we need resilience, we need strategy, and strategy without a plan is nothing, and a plan without strategy is nothing. We need two of these things, and we need tolerance for the vagaries of democracy.
Thank you very much. So we will conclude our discussion here. The programme will resume again in an hour when Julia Berghofer will be in conversation with the Defence Minister of Bulgaria, Todor Tagarev. In the meantime, feel free to stick around, eat some very delicious cake, but I hope also that you take away some thoughts about leadership, about resilience, and about courage. I think that's something really useful for all of us to hold on to. And it just remains for me to ask you to help me thank our speakers in the traditional manner.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
You've been brilliant.
Pleasure.
As always,
Oh,
you're
yes,
fabulous.
please.
Well done, Jane.
Thank you. I think we may have